Welcome to my Armchair Travel series here, presentation around our most recent trip to Spain. I've actually been to Spain. This was our third trip, or my third trip, and my husband's second. But in case you need a translation for the title that I chose, Tapas, Castillos y Bicicleta de Montaña, it's just small plates, so appetizers, castles, and mountain biking, which was pretty much the theme and focus of our trip to Catalonia and Mallorca. So just a little bit more info about me. Again, my name is Amanda Day. I am originally from Maryland. I'm actually in Maryland right now, enjoying the 70-degree weather and missing, I guess, the big snowstorm that you all are about to get. And my husband and I moved to Breckenridge in 2013 with our dog Drover, who is turning 12 this year, actually. We have a beautiful daughter, Penelope, who's upstairs with my in-laws right now, going nuts before bedtime. So if you hear her squeal, it is what it is. No apologies. And I am pregnant and I have one on the way. So I'm due at the end of May. So I'm ready for the snow to be over because I really am not, can't do much to enjoy it this year. As Sarah mentioned, I work remotely for a marketing agency. It's called Merkle. Been with them for about 9 years now. And luckily, 7 years ago, I think they let me move to Breckenridge and work remotely. So this whole working from home thing is not new to me. I also volunteer for Phi Mu Fraternity, serving as their finance advisor for the Xi Alpha chapter at CU Boulder, which is a newly initiated chapter. And when I'm not pregnant, I do love to travel, ski, mountain bike. I can still keep up with some of the hiking, and I do love to dance. There's a great studio in Frisco that has some fun classes. All right, so let me stop sharing my video and I'm going to get into the remainder of our presentation. And as Sarah mentioned too, I have taught several semesters at Colorado Mountain College. I taught consumer behavior. I haven't in about a year or two, so I just kind of pop in when they need me as an adjunct professor. Right. So I figured to start off, I'll just give everyone a few quick tips about how to start planning your trip if you haven't done, a major overseas trip or a trip to Europe. I've been several times and just kind of want to share my thoughts around, how best to start planning, because sometimes that's the hardest part is just where do you start? So when I'm thinking about going on a trip, like we did to Spain, I really think about, what's my budget? What's the max I'm willing to spend for this trip? And really just start putting money aside to start saving towards it. Because, hopefully you're planning a few months out, giving yourself enough time to start, stashing away some cash for your trip. And then, if you're traveling with someone else or traveling by yourself, just think about maybe make a list of top destinations. Sometimes we have a few destinations in mind and we'll kind of look at different flight options, and whatever looks like the best deal, we'll go for that unless we're really set on something. And really at that point, just book it. You don't have to have everything else figured out. Just book your flight, make a plan to go somewhere and the rest will follow. You'll figure it out. And really, and I'll get into a bit more on the following slide, but think about, what are the goals for your trip? What do you want to get out of it? And create a plan. So when I get into planning mode, once I've booked my flights, settled on a destination and a budget, I kind of think when I'm looking at setting my budget, I think about how long do I want to go on this trip for? Usually if it's an overseas trip, I want to go for at least 2 weeks, because you have a couple days that are always eaten up with travel, definitely to and from the States. And then sometimes you can, spend a whole day or two, depending on where you're going while you're on your trip. So I break it down really by price per night, and think about how much am I willing to spend per night? And that also helps me decide on what kind of accommodations we're going to stay in. And, helps me kind of filter down when I'm looking at hotels and Airbnbs based on that price per night, and, don't look anything above that because then I might be tempted to spend more. And then two, what I like to do ahead of time as I get closer to the trip is find those points of interest, those local attractions, even like maybe really, good restaurants that you want to check out, any kind of activities you want to do, and have a plan for that. You don't necessarily have to book things in advance, but at least do your research, read reviews of restaurants in the area. So you kind of have a list of, the top 5 or 10 restaurants that you want to try out. And that way, when you're over there, you've already done your research, that the restaurants will be good, or, maybe that attraction is something you really want to go see. And you don't have to spend time on your trip doing research, which I've made that mistake before. A couple of sites that I like to use when planning my trips. I actually really like using booking.com to book Airbnbs or hotels. It's just nice to have all of your accommodations in one website. So you're not looking through your email or having to print out, your hotel confirmations. You can just kind of have everything on one site, either on your phone or your laptop that you bring with you. And then Pinterest is actually a really good resource too. If you, look at the destination and some points of interest around where you're going, you can kind of get ideas for what other folks like to do on their travels, or places that they, are must-sees, along with TripAdvisor. I feel like I used to think TripAdvisor was a little bit outdated, but it really does have a lot of great reviews on there, and has kind of brought to light some ideas that, I wouldn't have thought of or found if I was looking elsewhere. So I definitely trust other people's reviews on things to do. And then I also like to use the Google Drive products to help organize my itinerary and make a plan. So this is an example of our itinerary to Spain. And we traveled at the end of May through early June. Our total vacation days were around 15, but like I said, we pretty much spent 2 days traveling back and forth to Colorado. I always like to do an overnight flight just because it's nice, especially if you don't have trouble sleeping on planes. Catch some Z's on the plane, you wake up and you're in, your destination early in the morning, and kind of have just enough time to make it to your hotel to, if you can't check in, at least drop your bags and start exploring the city or wherever it is that you're flying into. So our trip, we focused, Spain is a huge country. I still have not seen the southern part of Spain. So that's also on my list for one of our next trips. But we chose to focus our time just around Catalonia, and I had never been to Mallorca, which is an island off the coast of Spain, right above Ibiza, which probably maybe more people are familiar with. And when I first started planning this, my itinerary looked much different. I had a lot more stops on it, but my husband had to reel me back in and say, remember our last trip? We spent a lot of time traveling from place to place and not necessarily enjoying each destination that we were at. So had to rein it back in a bit and make some more time to actually sightsee and do some fun things and plan for some downtime. So when my husband and I travel, we like to rent a car. It's really not as intimidating as you think to drive while abroad. It's very similar to driving here in the US, especially Spain. Like, their roads are great, signage is great. It's really easy. So for the last couple of trips that we've done, I like to map out our drive in Google Maps. So you can kind of put different points of interest or stops and then figure out, okay, how long is it going to take me to get from, one point to the next. It really helps you plan out your itinerary and give you a realistic view of, how much ground you could travel. So like I said, we were there for 15 days. We chose to fly in and out of Barcelona, which I've been to several times. Always a great city to explore, and I never really get tired of going back. Then we went south just about an hour to a little coastal town called Sitges. Just stayed the night and actually met up with some friends who happened to be there that I hadn't seen since college. And we just connected on social media because I saw they were there at the same time. So that was kind of fun. Checked out a monastery at Montserrat. And like I said, this trip was really focused on like mountain biking and what I'll call castle tours. My husband's the avid mountain biker, even though I like to mountain bike too. But I figured if we're doing that, then I kind of want the romantic part of the trip to be staying at castles or going to visit castles. So I made that part of our driving tour. So a couple of the castle towns were Ainsa, Torla, and Alcazar. And then we circled back to Barcelona. And then we flew out of Barcelona to Mallorca, which was just a quick flight. Spent a week there, which was nice to kind of just relax and not be driving all over creation. And then, ended our trip in Barcelona for our last night and headed back to Colorado. So, like I mentioned, one of the planning resources that I like to use is Google Docs. This is just like a version of Excel. I think it's like Google Sheets. And I do this for all my trips. And I'm very type A, so this kind of stuff I love. But even if you aren't, it's just helpful to get your thoughts organized. Like, where am I going? How long am I going to be there? What are the main points of interest I want to see while I'm there? And then I always put in like a column for my hotel info. Even though it's all in booking.com anyways, I still like to put it here because I share it out with family before we leave, just in case, like emergency contacts, if they need to know where we're at or if anything happens on our trip, which luckily nothing horrible has happened on our trip. So that's good. And then you see at the bottom, I kind of have a couple tabs. I'll like keep notes as I think about them as I'm doing my research on TripAdvisor or Pinterest of things I definitely want to see, any restaurant or bars that I read really cool reviews on that we want to check out. And then I usually have a little to-do list of, things I need to get done before the trip. So now that I'm done my planning, I want to jump into some of the trip highlights with the fun photos and kind of walk you through that driving tour that we did. So like I mentioned, we started out in Barcelona, chose this as our entry and exit point for our round trip flights. I have found that when traveling abroad, it's cheaper to pick one city to fly in and out of. I've looked at like other scenarios of, say for this trip, I actually looked at flying into Barcelona and then doing a driving tour to the south of Spain and like flying out of an airport in the south of Spain. But it just, for some reason, it was not going to be worth the cost. So we chose a different route there. So if you've never been to Barcelona, I definitely recommend at least staying 3 to 4 days, nights there. And even that probably isn't enough. I have been to Barcelona before and I spent probably too long there. I think I was there for 10 days before, which I saw everything right after I graduated college with a friend. But taking my husband back there for the first time, I wanted to make sure he kind of saw all my favorite spots. And I will say, Barcelona was probably one of his favorite parts of the trip. The food is so good. The nightlife is great. There's so much to do. And a lot of it's within walking distance too, depending on where you choose to stay. We definitely chose close to the city center, but not like too close where it was too expensive. So I would say after being there a couple times, some of the must-see attractions for me are Park Güell, La Sagrada Familia, which, I've been to a lot of European cathedrals and churches, and this one is very unique. And if you're familiar with it, you know that it's still under construction. Um, but it's a beautiful cathedral and beautiful stained glass. And even if you're just walking by it and enjoying the architecture from the outside, it's definitely worth a visit. And then in most European cities, they always have some sort of archway, which you see in the center here. So that's Arc de Triomphe. Barcelona has a few beautiful parks that I, really enjoyed kind of just walking around and taking in the scenery. And then there's some really amazing architecture in Barcelona. At the top, you see a couple of buildings, Casa Batlló and Casa Millo. We didn't actually have time to do tours of the inside, so it's still on my list of something I'd like to do if we get to go back. But even just walking by and kind of taking in the site is worth it. And it's on the way to kind of a very famous street called La Rambla, where it's just this long strip that kind of goes from the city center down to the beach. And there's tons of restaurants. I love to kind of sit on La Rambla and have a glass of wine, and people watch is probably the best part. I will say, as with any city, you have to be very careful on that street in particular, though, for pickpocketers and, just not letting people too close to you to where they could take something off you. But as part of La Rambla, especially during the day, there's a really neat market. You can kind of grab a quick lunch at or get some fun snacks or souvenirs. And then there's also a Gothic quarter, and the Picasso Museum is in that area as well. And another fun thing to do for sightseeing, there's a funicular, so you can kind of go up and get a broad view of the city. And in the evenings near the funicular, they do a fountain show, and there's lots of great places to grab dinner and lots of fun nightclubs nearby. So like I said, we started and ended our trip in Barcelona. So, we had it on the front end of our trip and the tail end of our trip, and actually even in the middle before we flew out to Mallorca. So we had a lot of great evenings enjoying the cuisine and the nightlife there. So like I mentioned, we spent a few days in Barcelona, and then we just did a quick 35-minute drive down from Barcelona to a cute little coastal town called Sitges. My girlfriend in the middle here, she was actually there with her husband and happened to see that she was in Spain and going to Sitges the same night we were from Barcelona. So we met up and had dinner. So that was always fun. And it's really just a great small coastal town. Like if you're planning and say you're going to Barcelona and you're going to spend the majority of your trip there, but you want to get out of the city, it's just a quick trip if you want to go to a nice beach and a cute little town with cobblestone streets and shops and restaurants. It's really known for its beaches, and they have a very nice seafront promenade lined with these beautiful mansions. So very small, easy to you could just spend like a night or two there and you see the whole town. And we actually just spent one night and then kind of moved on. So from Sitges, we headed west and up towards our castle tour part of the trip and mountain biking part of the trip. On the way, we stopped at a monastery called Montserrat. It's a really popular day trip from Barcelona, pretty easy to get to. It's a beautiful multi-peaked mountain range. It has this, like I said, a monastery, and it just has like amazing views of the mountains and of Catalonia. And there's another funicular here that you can take to the top of the mountain, which we did. And there's just a lot of cool hikes you can do once you're up there. So we always try to get outside and do some outdoor activities, enjoy the scenery while we're on these trips, especially when you're driving around a lot in the car for hours at a time. It's nice to kind of plan these stops where you can get out and get some exercise. So from Montserrat, that was just like a pit stop on our way to Ainsa. This is one of Greg's, my husband's destinations. It's a beautiful medieval hilltop village, and it's famous for its Zona Zero World Enduro mountain biking trails. My husband's very into mountain biking. At that time, he was very into enduro mountain biking, like competitions, I guess. So he wanted to check out this place where the World Enduro was hosted. I think maybe back in 2016, I want to say. So as you can see, like the scenery was beautiful. The water in that river down below was just stunning. It was so blue, so turquoise, and it was just a cool little medieval town to explore. I will say, if you're not into mountain biking, I probably wouldn't recommend that you stop there because there's not much to do in Ainsa. It was just a one night trip for us, so we could get this mountain biking in. And I also will say that if you're into mountain biking and planning on doing that in any European country, really, you should hire a guide to take you on these trails, because we definitely spent probably more time than we needed figuring out the trail system and where we were going and how to get back to town. But we survived. It was just probably took us a little longer than we had planned. So from Ainsa, we headed to Torla. This was one of my castle towns that I had on my list. And another neat attraction nearby was the Cola de Caballo Trail. It's part of the Ordesa, a Monte Perdido National Park. So you can spend like a full day in the park, and the hike that we did was probably like a 5 to 6 hour out and back hike, but there's some beautiful, beautiful scenery along the way. And we ended our evening, this view of the castle, and we actually stayed in a room in one of the castle structures, and they had this beautiful plaza where we had dinner. So just a nice little romantic pit stop that had some outdoor activity fun around it as well. So then from Torla, we headed to Alcazar, another castle on my list. And the neat part about Catalonia is there's a lot of wineries. There's like a whole wine route, which isn't ideal, I guess, if you're driving long distances to stop at wineries on the way. But as long as you don't indulge too much, you can kind of make a few pit stops. So if you're doing a northern Spain driving tour, you can always find a nice winery and maybe bed and breakfast nearby that you can enjoy. But one of the main attractions near Alcazar was hiking along the Rio Vero Canyon. So you can kind of see, you really had to hike down into this canyon, and they had a great trail system, and it's kind of hard to see with the bottom photo below, but they had some somewhat sketchy stairs and bridges to like get through the canyon, but beautiful waterfalls. And again, ended the day in the castle town, exploring the medieval town and staying in another castle-like structure. So after our evening in Alcazar, we headed back to Barcelona. That was probably the longest stretch of our driving tour, about a 3-hour drive back. And like I said, there's a lot of neat wineries that you can kind of stop at along the way. So we spent the night in Barcelona in preparation for our little hopper flight over to Mallorca. And we spent a week in Mallorca. The island's not huge. It probably takes you an hour to drive from one point of the island to the other. So we did rent a car because we kind of broke our trip out with staying in southern Mallorca. And then we ended our trip in northern Mallorca, so south coast and the north coast. But each coast, I would say, of the island, even though it's not that large, was very different, but all very beautiful. My husband wants to go back again, do more mountain biking there. He wants to buy a house in Mallorca. Like, he's all about it. He really, really enjoyed his time there. So maybe one day. But Mallorca, like I said, most people are probably more familiar with Ibiza, but I would say I haven't been to Ibiza. I heard that's maybe more of a party island. So for the younger folks, I think it's similar to Mallorca in terms of the types of beaches and activities you can do. But for families, I would say Mallorca is probably a little bit better option. And it is one of the largest islands in the Balearic Islands, and it's right off the coast of Spain. So it's a really quick flight. I think you could even take a ferry if you wanted to, but we didn't really want to waste time on a ferry and preferred just to take a quick flight in, which wasn't expensive. So, I mean, things to do in Mallorca, they have beautiful beaches. You can kind of see a couple of the different coves that we explored. And in South Mallorca, that's where the capital is, Palma. So we had a really good time exploring Old Town Palma. Again, it's another kind of medieval type city, cobblestone streets, restaurants, a lot of nightlife. We ended up staying, if you can see the photo in the bottom right, it's called a finca. And I always look for Airbnbs over hotels when I'm traveling in Europe. I just find that it's better service, better food, it's more comfortable. You really feel like you're on vacation. And in Mallorca, they call most of their Airbnbs fincas, which are just little cottages or farmhouses, but the same type of idea of an Airbnb. And the finca that we chose was was only maybe like 20-30 minutes from Palma, but it was far enough away where you're driving in the dark that you don't really want to have too much to drink or, go out to the nightclub. So we didn't really get to enjoy the nightlife too much, just because of the drive that we had to do. But it was very quiet and beautiful with a nice private pool and these little cabanas. So I don't regret staying there, but if I were to go back, I might spend a couple nights actually, staying in a hotel in the heart of Palma just to really explore the nightlife. But as you can see, my husband posing in front of the royal palace. They have some beautiful cathedrals there. And we did a couple day trips. We stayed in the finca, maybe I think 3 or 4 nights. So we did a couple day trips to each coast of the island. Deo was beautiful. It had really impressive views of like these turquoise water coves that we found, and jutting cliffs and beautiful sunsets. And the top pictures here are of some beachside paella that we had overlooking one of the coves, which if you go to Spain, you have to try paella at least once. And it's even more fun if you can find a restaurant that will cook it and put it all together in front of you in a huge pan like they did for us here. And then on another part of the island, it was more not on the coast, but Mallorca is somewhat mountainous, I guess you could say, for Spain standards. There's a lot of great mountain biking, but this picture at the top was in Valdemosa. They're kind of known for these picturesque views and beautiful gardens. And to get there was a lot of winding switchback scenic roads. So highly recommend that if you do get to visit Mallorca. So after we checked out southern and I would say western Mallorca, we headed to the north to Pollença. And again, this was a little bit more relaxing. I would say as many attractions to go see. It's definitely more of just like the beach town, and we wanted to just end our trip, relaxing on the beach and enjoying the scenery. So, we stayed right on the beach, caught a couple flamenco shows, which is, if you've never seen before, it's so much fun, and just the outfits and the dancing, it's really good entertainment. And we did another mountain biking adventure in Mallorca, this time with a guide after we learned our lesson from earlier on in our trip. And my husband did a couple of mountain bike days. I just did one. And then these cliffside pictures that you see are of the Cap de Formentor. It was a beautiful drive, again, up some winding roads and just some really picturesque views overlooking the cliffs and the water and the sunset. So that pretty much wraps up my photo tour of Spain and our driving tour. And I have a few kind of tips and lesson learned for Spain specifically, and then just overall from my trips that I've taken abroad. So for Spain specifically, I'd say, like I mentioned, if you're visiting Mallorca, definitely look at staying at a finca. Just the experience and the level of service that you get is worth it. If you enjoy that type of like maybe more quiet, relaxing type of accommodation. Kind of, and then if you go to Spain, you have to try tapas. I mean, they have all sorts of different types of cuisine. That's really just means small plates, but it's a great way to explore the Spanish cuisine. And I don't know if my husband would agree, but I think the castle tour was worth it. However, I think maybe we could have just stayed at maybe one or two instead of like the 3 or 4 that we stayed at. Not to say if you've seen one, you've seen them all, but I think a couple would have been fine. And then we could have, had our fill of that. But definitely choose, if you wanted to kind of do a castle tour or stay in a castle or in a castle-like structure, like in a medieval town, I would choose one maybe that are near activities or points of interest that you want to go see or do. And then, like I said, if you're into mountain biking, always splurge for a guide. It's worth it just not to waste your time trying to figure out where you're going. And then this is, for Spain, but for any trip in general, if you have major, attractions that you want to go see, try to book your tickets in advance for a couple of them. That way you're not trying to figure it out while you're there, especially if you end up not having great internet or cell service, which can make it difficult. And then, plan your schedule around it and plan your itinerary around it. And then lastly, just for overall lessons learned and tips from traveling. I know this is a lot, but this is my running list of things that I keep in mind now when I travel. So my husband and I prefer to travel during shoulder season. We typically will go end of May, early June, most places. More recently, we went to France and we chose to do the fall instead, which was beautiful and nice and still shoulder season. However, we kind of felt like the service industry folks were a little burnt out at that point because it was the end of the season for them. So looking back, I kind of still recommend that May, June timeframe is a little bit better. It's before most of the kids get out of school over there. And then, all the folks and families start traveling and the weather is usually a little bit better and not so hot. And then when I'm booking airline tickets, and I feel like this changes all the time, and I haven't looked for them obviously recently with COVID and everything going on, but I tend to find better airline deals traveling midweek versus on the weekends. So if you could do like a Wednesday to Wednesday type of trip, that's usually a little bit more affordable than a Saturday to Saturday. And like I mentioned before, I found flying in and out of the same city is usually more affordable as well, if you can make that work. Keep in mind when traveling that you, especially overseas, you're going to have at least 2 days that are eaten up by travel. So, most folks are like, oh, a week vacation is great, but for overseas, try to do at least 2 weeks, knowing that you're not even going to get the full 2 weeks because you're going to spend a couple days traveling and catching up, jet lag and stuff like that. And, don't be afraid to rent a car. Like I said, it's really not that bad. We've rented a car in France, Greece, Spain. I'm sure there's a couple others I'm forgetting, and it has not been bad at all. We tend to rent a smaller car in European cities, especially. The streets can be pretty narrow, and sometimes you have to find a tight spot with parking. So smaller cars are better if you can. Make sure to get your international driver's license just in case. You don't always necessarily need it to rent a car, but just have it. You can get one through AAA for $15 or something like that. It's not expensive. And then make sure you're building in some rest days, and some days without a planned itinerary can be nice. So you can just kind of go explore on your own and not feel like you're being held to a certain schedule. Like I mentioned, I love staying at Airbnbs versus hotels. I just think the level of service is so much better. Usually you get a free breakfast or that's included in the price, and it's just more comfortable in general. And it's nice too, if you're gonna be somewhere for maybe more than 2 or 3 days, like look into an Airbnb where you have the whole place to yourself. You can maybe go to a local grocery store and even do some cooking, save some money that way. Before we go, like I said, it's always nice to map out some restaurants, read the reviews ahead of time so you're not spending time doing that on your trip. Google Translate is always helpful if you kind of run into a situation where maybe the person doesn't speak English or you're having a hard time communicating. I've found this to be a really helpful app on my phone. We always try to exchange currency prior to leaving the States. You can either do that via your bank. Don't expect that your local bank will have the currency that you need. Usually you have to order it and they can get it within a couple days. I believe AAA can also help with that too. I just recommend getting it prior because if you use an airport kiosk, it can be really expensive. And then we always usually travel with a credit card that doesn't have a foreign transaction fee. That's something really important to pay attention to because if you're using your credit card on your trip, you can really rack up some unneeded dollars with those transaction fees. And then this next one is probably the biggest tip. Like if you don't do any of this, do this one thing is get a local SIM card for your phone when you arrive at your destination, because most carriers like Verizon or AT&T, you pay them $10 a day, but if you're on a 2-week trip, like that really adds up fast. And the SIM card you can get for like $25 maybe at the most. I think there's probably cheaper options depending on where you're going, and you have unlimited data. The service is so much better. I found if I use Verizon or AT&T abroad, the service really isn't that great. So you're like paying $10 a day for not great connection to the internet. Where if you get a local SIM card, it's just like you had a phone if you had a phone through a provider in that country, and the service is just much, much better. For the women here, I would say don't bring your curling irons or blow dryers because they're probably going to break even with an adapter. I've broken several expensive hair tools. And then on that note, bring a few adapters so you can charge all of your like camera, your phone, Apple Watch, whatever, Fitbit while you're on your trip. And then the thing that's the hardest for me, but I'm always glad I do it, is travel light if you can. I try to just pack a carry-on and like a backpacking backpack, and you can surprisingly fit a lot of clothes and toiletries if you roll your clothes versus just folding them, or even buy those like those airtight bags that you can kind of like squeeze the air out of. You can fit a lot in a backpacking backpack that way. And keep in mind that you can always do laundry too. If you're on a trip for 2 or 3 weeks, most places, like either if it's a hotel or an Airbnb, you can always ask to see if you can, get a load of laundry done. So you don't have to kind of pack something for every single day of your trip. And then last piece of advice, if you have the luxury of coming back a day or two before you have to go back to work, it's really worth it because you're going to be jet lagged, and it's going to be nice to kind of relax, unpack, do some laundry, and get settled before you head back to work. So with that is all I got for my Spain trip, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Amanda.